Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And it's here, ladies and gentlemen, our favorite albums of the year. 2023 has been building to this moment. We've talked about our favorite songs. We've talked about our least favorite albums. We've talked about albums that you need to catch up on. So go and watch all those to get to here, where we can finally kiss 2023 goodbye. Another great year for music, to be sure, but also another year where I think that we've needed music more than anything.
So we were tired.
Absolutely. Without further ado, let's get into our top 20 albums of 2023, kicking it off at number 20 with been flying the flag for the Rat Boys ever since I discovered them earlier this year with the release of the first single for this album, the 8-minute Titanic. Black Earth, Wisconsin, one of my absolute favorite songs of the year. As I've said many times, it is a solid 4-minute indie rock song with an incredible, phenomenal 4-minute guitar solo just inserted into the middle of it. And ultimately, it becomes this Frankenstein's monster masterpiece that I never get tired of. But the album itself is more than just that one song. There's so many great songs on this. It's, on the one hand, it's like the expert in a dying field of this year, in the sense that it's like a solid, dependable, reliable indie rock album that doesn't reinvent the wheel. But also, when you listen to it, when you appreciate the craft of the songwriting and just how professional and well-oiled this band is, you also realize how much we need that more than ever, how important it is to have reliable, dependable, really strong indie rock bands that are pushing forward and flying the flag and delivering a sound that will always feel comfortable, always feel homely, always feel satisfying. And that's what The Window is. One of my top 10 albums of the year, easily an album I've not been able to stop listening to ever since the album came out. One of my most hyped albums of the year. Just love it to bits. Love the title track in particular is an incredible, again, story song. We had talked a lot about grief and grief songs in the last video. Title track of this album is right up there with them as well. If you've ever had to say goodbye to a loved one in less than ideal circumstances, the title track of this album will make you feel some shit you don't want to feel, and it will also become one of your favorite songs of the year. And the record really is filled with moments of emotional heft and just giddily satisfying, punchy indie rock that matches that at every turn. An incredible record. I still feel it's going under the radar, so go and listen to it if you haven't already. Rat Boys, The Window, great album.
This album, Struggler here, is Genesis Owusu pushing his sound forward, refining it into something that's a little bit less expansive than the incredibly celebrated, especially by us, Smiling with No Teeth, an album that showed limitless potential. And to me, Struggler is the absolute fulfillment of all of that potential. If you had to ask me what album has the best array of hooks on just in general for 2023, I will breathlessly say this one. Every single song on here, even the songs on here that aren't the big heavy hitters, are ones that I have hummed along to incessantly. Freak Boy, The Old Man, See You There, Balthazar, all of these hooks are just fucking fantastic. Genesis Owusu has such a confident delivery of his lyricism, which is deeply conceptual, just as it was on the last album, but here it's a bit tighter of a narrative arc, and he does so by exploring some sounds that are a little bit dance punkier. This is kind of the year where post-punk and dance punk really bled through into a lot of great releases, and nowhere better showcased than something like this, a less than 40-minute long album that simply never runs out of steam. Leaving the Light is one of my favorite songs of the year. It's anthemic, it's rhythmic, it breaks into something more open and spacious in the second half, and everything that comes after that too is just as remarkable. I love shit like Tied Up or Freak Boy or That's Life a Swamp, which has a bass line on it that could give Thundercat a run for his money.
Absolutely.
And there's also the more soulful melodic cuts on here, like Stuck to the Fan, that I just just they're fucking beautiful. There's never a moment where Genesis isn't going absolutely hard. He's apparently an amazing act to see live. If you can catch him, I highly recommend doing so. Friend of the podcast, Jen, got to see him earlier this year and said that he was absolutely fucking phenomenal to witness. This is an album that too so well suits to like experiencing it live just because it's made for a fucking mosh pit. I cannot tell you how many times I've put on this album this year when I've just been like, man, I need something to keep me going. I need something to act as a kind of auditory caffeine. And this is it. It is one of the most addictive albums of the year.
Like pressure. It's bleeding over.
All right, number 18 on our list, and we go to something where rhythm is just as important, though in a very different way, with Model Actra's debut album, Dog's Body. All night, me and my wretched device. This album...
With a body count higher than a mosquito.
Bitch, I might enter into my pure mode. This album...
I don't know what a pure mode is, but it terrifies me.
This album is simultaneously the scariest and the sexiest album of the year, and I will ride for that take like nothing else. This album makes me afraid for my life. It makes me feel like I am about to be laid down on a bed of nails and fucked with a drill. It makes me feel scared and excited and petrified and thrilled. The energy on this thing is violent. The grooves are ferocious. This to me is one of the best breakthrough albums of the year from just a band that have been kind of
Totally.
toiling away for a while, but have just come through with a fully realized project that has blown my ass out. I am sorry, and I'm using all of this language because Model Actra's Dog's Body, it's a very heavily sexual album. It's a very heavily queer album as well. It's an album where sexuality, and particularly queer sexuality, is weaponized into this kind of force of dominating power. And I swear to God, it's everything. This album, boy, has this album been a good thing for me this year.
Look,
Oh,
I said it when we
Chino
reviewed
Moreno
this
type
album
riz.
earlier in the year, and I will say it again. This is Block Party by way of Bauhaus, and if you don't think that that's an awesome combination, go fuck yourself.
well,
It
it's also
rules.
just like,
Yes,
what
adds
if
to library.
what if you had a
Huh?
dance? What if you had a dance punk band that had made their guitars sound like the Bernard Herrmann strings in the Psycho shower scene? Like that's what
Yeah.
they sound like. And then
Emphatically adds to library.
and you pair that with the bass sound that sounds like someone is digging into the earth with heavy machinery. And then the icing on cake being the Jamie Stewart-esque vocal delivery of this like deeply laconic queer narrator who's just like, yes, yes, yes.
It's the gothiest shit in the universe. Like it's like 1 degree of separation away from being like a typo negative style delivery.
Yeah, and through all of these comparisons and things that
I'm
we've
hard.
made, you're still not going to hear anything quite like this. It is
Mm-mm.
be prepared to be bewildered, but also be prepared to dance like your life depends on it. Like you will die if
Mhm.
you don't hit this groove and hit it right. And then there's a couple of ballads and slower moments on this record as well that they really nail. But really, what you're going to be coming to this for is the 80% of it that just breaks you. Another album that breaks you in a different way. Anoni and the Johnsons' album, My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross. Anoni and the Johnsons, one of the 2000s most critically revered and beautiful and dark soul projects as well. A deeply queer project even before frontwoman Anoni Hegarty's transness was publicly acknowledged or understood or accepted or even talked about. Now, with her more recent work, that has been something which has come more to the forefront, but primarily this record, like Anoni's recent solo records, is a record about the feeling of living in a world that is slowly burning alive, both in a real physical, tangible sense and in a socio-cultural sense. It's an album about human suffering. It's an album about injustice, and it's an album about pain. But it's also an album about solidarity, and it's also an album about survival. And it is crucially all of those things without ever signaling that, oh, this is a significant album about profound themes, or this is an album for the moment, or any of that stuff. This is a refreshingly frank album that approaches its heavy subject matter without any kind of pretension towards profundity. It is, in a lot of ways, a disarming record because of how blunt it is, because of how brutal it is. I put the one of the multiple centerpieces that this album has, the song Rest, on my Songs of the Year list. I think that is one of the most glorious, colossal pieces of music that's been released all year. But you could say that about a number of different songs on this record as well. I mean, a song like Scapegoat, where Anoni just ruthlessly and brutally embodies the perspective of someone being subjugated and of someone committing subjugation. You're so killable. I can say what I want. I can use you like a toilet. I can punch you and take all of my hate into your body like an apple hanging on a tree. All I have to do is take it. All I have to do is want it. And the way that she sings that line, take all of my hate and put it into your body, is so. There's no one who's approaching and confronting cruelty on whatever level it exists, whether it is directly interpersonal or whether it's on a more global scale. No one is putting a voice to that the way that Anoni does, with the voraciousness and the violence that she does. And she does it in a way where it's impossible to deny, and it's so affecting that it's breathtaking. I could only cheapen it by going deeper into it. An incredible record that has been a deserving sort of reassertion into the limelight and critical acclaim for Anoni as well. I can't wait to see what the future of the project is, considering that I believe this is the first record with the Johnsons backing band in over a decade. So I'm really excited. It's an astonishing record and one of the year's best comebacks.
Shock of all shocks, another Panopticon album is a masterpiece. I know I'm just as surprised as you are. It's no secret that we bang the drum heavy for Austin Lunn and company when it comes to Panopticon. And Again Into the Light was our album of the year for 2021, one of my 10 favorite albums of all time. And I cannot stop singing this band's praises. And that is not going to change today, because The Rime of Memory is a phenomenal album that also manages to unearth several different facets of Panopticon's music that have sort of lied dormant or just haven't really been explored that heavily in a while now. The last few canon Panopticon albums have been very harsh, very like production that is incredibly off-putting, that I wouldn't begrudge anyone for being turned away by the abyssal darkness of something like The Scars of Man on the Once Nameless Wilderness. But here we have something with The Rime of Memory that's way more indebted to post-rock and post-metal, and it's a little bit lighter on folk than Panopticon has ever been, but with these emphasis on these different disparate genres here, this makes for maybe the most accessible album that he's made since Autumn Eternal, and also one of the most structurally audacious. Every single song on here is a titanic, towering piece of music that absolutely suffocates you in its snowblind atmosphere. It's an album about mortality. It's an album about climate change. It's an album about weathering the storm of life, and the instrumentals make you feel like you are weathering a storm, and it is very, very difficult to listen to at times just because of how overpowering it can be. But on that note, I still think that this would be a great entry point for people to get into Panopticon's music, because it's not quite as oppressive as previous entries. Like, this is a record that reminded Riley and I both of the music of Agalloch more than this band have ever sounded like that band, in fact. And it's got some of their best songs. I think Winter's Ghost is one of my favorite songs of the year, and the single Cedar Skeletons is not far behind. Couldn't be more pleased with the fact that Austin is still pushing his sound into different realms, still exploring new territory, but also, relenting a little bit and allowing a more easy in for some more modern listeners. So trust me, there has never been a better time to get into Panopticon. He is on a streak of records that has been going on for longer than a decade now. And The Rhyme of Memory was something where I was almost kind of nervous to listen to it, because I was like, we talked about this when we reviewed the new National albums this year. When a band is in their Imperial era, you're always a little bit worried, like, is this going to be the moment where they drop the ball a little bit? Is this going to be the moment where they stop cranking out essential, incredible material? And honestly, when I hear The Rhyme of Memory, I think Austin could not be further from that point in his career.
Yeah, this is one of my top 3 favorite albums of the year. It's just rare to have something in metalcore, a genre of music that I love deeply, but also frequently irritates the shit out of me. So it's rare to find an album that so completely energizes and excites me about where the genre is currently. The Moments Elsewhere and Johnny Booth have done that. If you're a fan of the genre or extreme music at all, I would listen to the song Collapse in the Key of Fireworks, which is one of my favorite songs of the year. And if that doesn't sell you on this band immediately, then it's probably just not for you. Yeah, Immaculate Underheard record.
Number 14 on the list goes to the new album from Liturgy, 93696, which Jake and I experienced almost. I think this might be another case where we listened to this around the same time earlier this year, and both came to the almost immediate realization that this is the best album Liturgy have made. And Liturgy have a little bit of a history when it comes to this channel people might not be aware of. The album, The Artwork, one of the most divisive Liturgy albums, was one of the very first record clubs we did. That was a really entertaining time talking about that Bizarro album, which admittedly was kind of a pretty strong departure from most of what you expect from Liturgy sonically, although philosophically and thematically it's very Liturgy. But ever since then, with records like HAQQ and 2020's Origin of the Alimonies, Liturgy have kind of attempted to reassert and reinvigorate their particular brand of what they call transcendental black metal, which in this context just means like black metal sounds and compositions that are like incredibly minimal, which means that often they'll just play 1 or 2 or 3 notes. They'll repeat these passages and they'll play them as loud and impactfully as possible and create these compositions built around this simple idea, right? A very minimal compositional idea, and creating this intense, long-winded, brutal expression of that's supposed to, I think, induce a sense of body transcendence, basically. By if you play it loud enough, if you let it go on, it's supposed to, I believe, invoke this state essentially that removes you from your body. That's my understanding of the broad intent of Liturgy. And so it should come as no surprise that this new Liturgy project is 80 minutes long. It is structured in this almost symphonic pattern. You have an assortment of shorter, more interstitial tracks surrounding these behemoth central pieces, such as Generation, but spelled like gent, which is a great pun and reference to one of their earlier songs. These compositions are, of course, the work primarily of one Hela Ravenna Hunt Hendricks, who's teamed up with Steve Albini to produce this particular record, which is a really smart decision for what Liturgy do because it emphasizes the brutality. He's a producer who's known for bringing out this rough edge and placing things like drums really, really high in the mix. And that impact really lends well to what Liturgy are doing on this record. Also, I would say that the compositional style, despite how I've described it just before, is actually a little bit more complex and interesting than it's been on, say, HAQQ, which is also a great album, in the sense that there's a lot more variation in how these tracks progress, and the interstitial moments are a lot better woven in with the longer pieces of music than they have been on previous Liturgy albums, where they're just kind of there. I think that the structure is really well refined on this, and there's even moments where in these longer pieces I was reminded of all bands, Between the Buried and Me, with some of their
Yeah.
more unusual instrumental inclusions in these tracks, where you have things like more conventional stringed instruments and other things that come in and pop up in these songs a little bit unexpectedly and flow into the weird piecemeal structure really, really nicely. I think it's an utter triumph for Liturgy, and yeah, pretty much my favorite album of theirs to date. An incredible piece of work. One that's admittedly difficult to come back to because of how punishing it is, just in terms of the loudness of it. But if you're on board with that, if you're able to get past that hurdle, this is some of the most rewarding and satisfying and just gritty and brilliant music that I think Liturgy have ever made. So check it out.
Goodness gracious me, what can even be said about this album at this point? We did a fantastic breakdown of it earlier in the year when it came out. Very good episode. Would highly recommend checking that out, where I break down the sort of core narrative that this record contains within it. Eve Toomer is one of the most interesting artists of like the past decade. And the more I've gotten into their music, starting with Safe in the Hands of Love, and then I went back and sort of explored their back catalog. Slowly over the course of this year, Eve Toomer went from an artist I've loved individual projects from to one of my favorite artists, period. And I would be lying if I said that that wasn't mostly due to Hot Between Worlds here, because the stakes have been upped in every single way possible. This contains several of the most show-stopping songs of the year. The opener, God is a Circle, is one of the most tense, anxious, and driving songs of the year. Lovely Sewer is just this beautiful, bright, art rocky explosion. Meteora Blues is this gorgeous shoegaze influenced rock track. We already talked about Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood being one of the best songs of the year, having one of the best moments in music this year. And there's also some of the dancier moments on here, like Echolalia or Fear Evil Like Fire or Purified by the Fire. The closer, Ebony Eye, which is this album at its most soulful. I mean, this is another album that was certainly capitalized on the sort of new burgeoning wave of dance punk and post-punk that like really adds a dynamism to Eve Toomer's sound that wasn't there before, but I'm so glad is there now. And this blending of neo-psychedelia and art rock and occasionally, like, again, glammier moments too that carry over from the last album,
Really
something
taking
that just
advantage of the fact that the front person's surname is Bowie.
I've thought about this comparison a lot. In my opinion, Hot Between Worlds here, this is the 21st century answer to the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust in terms of not just its eclectic combination of sort of gender bending aesthetics and genre signifiers together to create something sort of wholly unique and completely liminal in the world of music, but in terms of the actual narrative arc of this is an album that's about trying to reconcile differences between your perceived identity and who you feel you are, and sort of challenging the status quo on an almost divine level. But the journey, the arc of this album is one of self-actualization. Eve Toomer as a vocal presence is insanely weird and androgynous that often scrapes at the upper register. Again, it was something that you said in our review, is that they're not traditionally what's considered a great singer. But again, it's like, the performances that you would find on like an early Prince album, where it's kind of like yelpy and more expressionistic than it is like, technical in nature. But the more I grew accustomed to that, the more I loved the idiosyncrasies that Eve Toomer brought to the table. And I love that music like this is still challenging me in that way, that I can still like not be fully on board with something. And then like the more I listen to it, the more I can just sort of grow to understand its implementation on here. And there's just so many moments that remind me of classic staples of alternative music, but things that I love. There's things like the sample of The Cure's 100 Years on the song Lovely Sewer. The drum sampling is taken from that. The song Parody or Operator honestly reminds me a lot of tracks that you would find on like a Susie and the Banshees album. It's like there's so many reference points that I have for this album that it is impossible to wholly compare it to absolutely anything. And I've come back to it over and over again, and I'm still uncovering little facets of the instrumentation, which, again, courtesy of production wonderkind Alan Mulder, who does a fantastic job making the instrumentals on here, which are bright, fuzzy, and positively incandescent, sound as big as humanly possible. It feels like they are sort of usurping the throne that someone like Bowie left behind, where they had no limits for themselves other than what they found interesting and what they found to be compelling, and what they wanted their audience to interrogate. And I'm so thrilled that music like this is being made at all, let alone as skillfully as it is in Sean Bowie's hands. So good on you.
You don't know how much I
At number 12, we have the second national album of 2023 entitled Laugh Track. And, it's no small secret that none of us on this podcast were particularly fond of the first album that the National released this year. So it was just really, really satisfying for me, especially as this is my number 2 release of the year. It's particularly satisfying to see them sort of come around and fully deliver a project that was really high quality. We go more in depth on it in a review, but it's a moment where the National are sort of pulling themselves apart and putting them back together again as a band, and it's really invigorating to listen to overall.
Yeah, I've seen a mixture of takes on these two national albums. I think the predominant opinion I've seen, interestingly, is that they're both kind of equally uneven in different ways, which is really interesting to me because while I do agree that Laugh Track has less of a kind of internal identity for itself than, say, every other national album between Alligator and I'm Easy to Find, it is still an album that brings together some really great national songs and also reasserts some of the National's best characteristics, most reliable characteristics. Brian Devendorf's drumming going absolutely ham all over the place. A few bits of experimentation as well that are pulled off really, really nicely. I mean, really, the only weak points of the album are the one or two songs where it sounds a little bit too much like the other album, or just like the kind of late mode that they've settled into. So I think honestly, though it doesn't have a huge amount of an internal identity, it is a really successful record in terms of reinvigorating what makes the National so great. And if these two new records are where a lot of their newer audience, who are a Zoomer audience, are encountering them, I think it gives them a nice sense between these two records of everything that National are in this current era, as well as that what they have been in the past too. So hopefully they take some of that forward into the future as well. Yeah, great album.
Blackout, am I better now?
At number 11, we have Hot Mulligan's Why Would I Watch? And this was my introduction to this band. I actually I hadn't even heard of them before they were mentioned on the podcast, and I was immediately intrigued by the curious song titles that they seem to.
But what's curious
You know,
about shouldn't have a leg hole, but I do, or Christ alive, my toe damn it hurts, huh?
I mean, where's the leg? Where?
John the Rock Cena, can you smell what the Undertaker? Just a classic song title.
But I was completely overwhelmed in the best way by the emotional sincerity of this music, and the way it's put together and performed, especially. This album has an incredible energy to it, even in its more sort of atmospheric moments. And it's an album that I've frequently revisited as the years gone on.
Like, this is the most anthemic and riotous pop punk album of the year. And it's kind of like one of those things where when you hear it, you're like, fuck, we used to be a country. You know what I mean? These albums like this used to be like happening all the time. And it's like, it's such a balm to be given a record that's such a successful throwback to like a classic pop punk sound, while still sounding very 2023, very modern, a little bit of like kind of postmodern, hyper realist internet age, personality to it, but not to the extent that it's overbearing or detracts from the fucking power of the riffs and just how much of an emotional gut punch it is. Really, like, this is this year's like Brave Faces Everyone, except instead of the life or death seriousness of that record, there's just a sense of irreverence that runs through this that feels very in keeping with the way we all live our lives now, slightly detached from the horror of our reality, and approaching things with a sideways glance and a bit of humor, because that's how you get through it. This is an album that understands that and really nails what it feels like to be alive in 2023 and just be trying to be a fucking normal person and live a decent life. Fucking ragers and themic bangers for days. Put this shit on in your car. Put this shit on your moped. Put this shit on wherever you are and get your fucking shit kicked. Because we all need it.
Baby, keep hitting me up. Oh no, don't you go pull me down. Baby, keep hitting me up. Oh no, don't you go pull me down.
10th place here, we have Jessie Ware, her second inclusion on an year-end list of ours. And for those of you familiar with the narrative of this podcast, you'll know that one of the first albums we reviewed was Jessie Ware's What's Your Pleasure, an album that was, I'll say divisive, but it really wasn't divisive. It was literally just me who didn't like it. So I don't really technically count that, but it's a testament to this album's strength that it was enough to pull me over into Jessie Ware's corner. This is one of the most easily enjoyable albums to be released this year. Like it's a tight 40-minute long 10-track record, but half this track list is the pop song of the year. Like Free Yourself has a hook on it that's just absolutely fucking undeniable. Pearls is gaudy and expressionistic in all the ways you'd want it to be. We talked about Begin Again, an absolutely flawless new disco song. But there's also moments on here that get a little bit weirder, get a little bit campier, that I have just grown to enjoy more and more as the year has gone on, just because I've needed a kind of dose of something that's a little bit more tonally on the lighter side. So stuff like Shake the Bottle has, it makes me laugh, but I still do find it like musically compelling and whatnot. But this particular sort of array of throwing it back to disco that's a little bit older than what she explored on What's Your Pleasure yields one of the warmest and most inviting pop albums of the decade so far, let alone this year. An album that I think deserves to be put along right upside What's Your Pleasure in terms of what an achievement it is in bringing these sounds into a modern context, a context that is open, that is expressive, that is queer, or whatever you want it to be. It's one of the most freeing albums of the year, an album that is just endlessly fun, endlessly danceable, never runs out of momentum, and is just an absolute blast the whole way through.
Got to appreciate Jessie really leaning into this diva sensibility that she's developed, honestly, quite far from where she started with a more humble pop record like 2013's Devotion. I really admire how Jessie has seen the audience that What's Your Pleasure has given her, has understood in the assignment in terms of like how a lot of gay men in particular have resonated with her music, and a lot of her music has resonated with queer people in general. Fully embraced that and leaned into the theatricality to just go full-throated with it on this album, right down to the title itself having the 2 exclamation marks. I just love that so much. I love that spirit that it has. It's been great to see Jessie going from strength to strength like that.
Night falls like pop wild and it's coming in hot, trying not to fight it. That helicopter, that 5-0 siren, see me squawking, buy me those vice grips.
Aesop Rock is one of those artists who's been around for so long, so consistent, that it's very easy for him to be taken for granted. It's very easy for his greatness to be just assumed in a certain way. And as a result of that, I think people can maybe just sort of think, oh yeah, there's a new Aesop Rock album out. I'm sure it's great because he's great. I need to be listening to something that's going to surprise me more or whatever. There's a weird mindset, I think, where he's a little bit overlooked in the hip hop world as well. Maybe because increasingly he's more out of place with it and less interested in kind of fitting into the firmament. But nevertheless, Integrated Tech Solutions is a fucking triumph. One of Aesop Rock's best albums, one of his most involved albums conceptually, while also at the same time having a lot of looseness to its concept so that it can approach basically what is a series of songs about Aesop Rock's life in his 40s in the modern world, negotiating his relationships to the world through technology and how that affects his everyday experience, but also taking things from more of a sideways glance. How does being an aging rapper affect the way that he interacts with the world? How does being an artist affect the way that he sees the world? Is everything just a commodity that can be turned into art? How does that mediate the way that you live your life when you're an artist who has this body of work and this ferociously creative mind, how does that affect the way that you live your life, basically? That's a theme that he interrogates really deeply on this album, and he manages to pull off the really surprising and difficult feat of making that particular creative quagmire that artists who've been around for a really long time experience feel like a universal thing that we can all relate to, in terms of the jadedness of having to exist in the world and being inundated constantly with reminders of things, and with content and stuff and stimuli all the time, forgetting how beautiful and rewarding and life affirming it can be to just see something in the world and appreciate it for what it is. Something like a river, something like birds, something like any of the particular ephemera that Aesop zeroes in on the various songs on this record. It's a quietly in its own way, it is one of the year's most life affirming albums. It's ridiculously funny. It's got a snarky spirit to it. It has the year's single best story song in the form of Aggressive Steven, which we talked about at length when we reviewed this album. A hilarious piece of comedy, a lovely, humble slice of life, and also a brutal criticism of the system of American cities and the failure of late capitalism, all of those things in one. And Ace is so adept at being able to turn his songs into all of these things at the same time, while still also feeling like you're just listening to a guy you could probably hang out with, talk about his day, basically. One of the best doing it, one of the best to have ever done it. Don't take him for granted. Go and listen to Integrated Tech Solutions, an absolute album of the year frontrunner.
At number 8, we have what I feel is one of music's most triumphant moments in 2023. New album from Foo Fighters, but here we are. What's been so consistently moving about it and coming back to it over and over again as the years gone on. It just feels like a testament to the human spirit and sheer force of will, sort of reflected in the title of the album itself and across so many songs. Learning to pick yourself back up while acknowledging how difficult that is and really mining that for as much catharsis as possible on this album. An incredible moment for this band. It's their best album in years. It's going to go down as one of their best in general.
It's a great showcase of what a foundationally brilliant band the Foo Fighters are, because it's not that, suddenly grief has made them get good again or whatever. It's that they can, if they want to, turn on a dime and basically churn out their best shit, churn out a classic iteration of the band, writing incredible songs, some of the best that they've ever written. They can do that at force of will. Dave Grohl and co can do that. And it's not that, I don't believe personally anyway, that it's that tragedy brought that out of them. I think in some ways it was the catalyst for pursuing this direction actively with the album, and it certainly informs the songwriting. But really, what this album is a showcase that the Foos are a great fucking band that we've been taking for granted, admittedly because they've been putting out subpar material in more recent years, but also just that we always need to remember that even if a band we love or a great band are in a downturn phase, that doesn't mean they aren't capable of making their best shit. It just means that they're in a space where they're pursuing something that maybe we're not completely fully on board with personally, and that's fine. But this is a great showcase of how even when bands are in that phase, they can, if they want to, turn on a dime and deliver something like this that will just completely floor you, that will completely blow you to pieces emotionally. And we are blessed for them having chosen to bestow that upon us. So thank you, Based Grohl. For number 7 on our list, we have Young Father's Heavy Heavy. And at the start of the year, this was one of my most anticipated albums. I was raving about the lead singles of this record last year, several of which made my favorite songs of the year list. And basically, I was frothing at the mouth for this because the singles were incredible. And I had also, on a personal level, really been wanting to get along with this band for a long time because I've always struggled with them. I've always had a great deal of appreciation for them. I think White Men or Black Men Too is a great album and an amazing album title. And I also found a lot to enjoy about the album that followed it, which I cannot Cocoa Sugar. I also found a lot to enjoy about Cocoa Sugar, even if ultimately the sparseness of that album made me feel like left me wanting more. Heavy Heavy, however, fitting album title, this fucking thing delivers. 30 minutes of some of the most jubilant and full-throated, celebratory, in-your-face, holy shit, euphoric music that I've heard all year. It has a fairly predictable structure in the sense that most of the songs develop in the same way, which is that they start with a few simple elements, they pile more in, and then by the end of it, the songs have built to this high, this absolutely cataclysmic high of sustained euphoric bliss that makes you feel like you have scaled Everest. And they rinse and repeat that across the 30 minutes. But the real triumph of the record is the way that they find new ways to do that and new contexts for that feeling of building to this euphoric rush. Heavy Heavy is an album you put on when you need to feel like you could fucking do anything, when you need the will to persevere, and when you need to have your fucking body lifted into the sky, metaphorically. I don't think this could sustain flight. But it's a great fucking album that has completely won me over to the band, completely changed my understanding of their mission statement and their approach to music, and ultimately just given me some of the most rewarding and cathartic experiences I've had all year with music. So check this album out. It's really short and it does not waste a single second of that runtime. The grooves, the instrumental variation, the complexity, the performances, the lyrics, and just the catharsis of these pieces make it all worth it. So, yeah, great album.
I don't really know how to talk about this album. It's kind of why I didn't at first, because this was an album that I had listened to and then promptly didn't really share with anybody. Firstly, since we didn't talk about it, I just want to say that The Weight of the Mask here is the most recent effort from post-hardcore, emo, black gaze, black metal band, Svalbard, who have been slowly building up a pretty impressive catalog of music, all things considered. They had a really acclaimed album with their last record, 2020's When I Die, Will I Get Better? And this is sort of, I think, their like major label debut record. And it sounds like it. This is a very expensive sounding metal album that has these immensely bright sounding guitars, like the brightest sounding guitars I've heard in black metal, bar none, like without any competition whatsoever. But with song structures that are a little bit more traditional, more indebted to post-hardcore and emo, and a lot of lyricism that's a lot more indebted to post-hardcore and emo. In fact, a lot of the material on here is closer to something like Touche Amore than it would be something like Death Heaven, for example, which is a comparison this band often gets. And I do think that there are a lot of sonic similarities between this album and Sunbather. And particularly in how they like layer on the atmosphere, and they'll have certain instrumental ideas that just kind of cut through the production, particularly the insanely tight guitar melodies on here, which are worthwhile. Just like that's what you should come to this album for, instrumentally speaking. But the real source of my affinity for The Weight of the Mask and what makes it one of my 5 favorite albums of this year, and a perfect album in my opinion, is the writing. Reading along to the lyrics of Faking It, the opening track on here, I was like, I'm not even gonna lie, like even while I'm talking about it right now, I'm threatening to get like choked up a little bit. Like the lyricism on here is so confrontational and blatant and almost like awkward in how plain it uses its language to describe things like depression, to describe things like loneliness and all of that stuff. But what really gets me is that it's so plain and honest and sincere. When I listen to a song like Faking It and I read along with the lyrics, it's legitimately difficult for me to just not burst into tears. Like I remember listening to this song on the car ride over here, and I was just like, I was struggling to keep it together this morning. And this song in particular is about looking back at an old photograph of yourself where you don't recognize the person that you're looking at because they're putting on the affectation of happiness to hide something, you know, dark about themselves or something that they're suffering from. Just that notion of seeing that person, not recognizing them, not understanding why they were happy, and then feeling that kind of internal dissonance was something that struck a real chord with me this year. And this whole album is littered with sentiments like that that are very on their face, kind of complicated, but still very emotionally direct. Like the song Eternal Spirits, which is about the basically musicians who have died young and contributed music to the world that has like helped and inspired people and helps them keep going. Like it was really hard for me not to think about musicians like Scott Hutchinson when listening to songs like Eternal Spirits, or there's just songs that are plainly about motivating yourself to keep going when things threaten to collapse around you, or when you threaten to collapse, like Defiance, which is just a song that is about taking it one step at a time and biting the bullet and just soldiering on and going forward. And it's such an affirming record. It plainly tells you lyrically that the battles that you fight are not insignificant. The atmosphere of this record, which really reminds me of something like Rollo Tomasi, or even the most recent Pupil Slicer album, the way that it uses those bright incandescent guitar melodies on here to sort of cut through them, it is so synergistic with the way that this album is written, to the point where every hook, every lyrical refrain, every idea just gets embedded into you. And some of these moments are just wholly overwhelming. There are moments like How to Swim Down or Be My Tomb, where the lead vocalist on this album, an amazing year for women in metal, by the way, but it's not a huge album. It's gotten a lot of attention, and it's also not for everyone. It's a lot of sounds that like may not work with you. I would recommend it to people who like stuff like Rollo Tomasi or even Deftones, for example. And also the writing style may not be for you, again, because it's that very direct confrontational emo lyricism. But at the same time, it's something I found deeply moving, and I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested.
This is one of my favorite first listen experiences of the year. This completely bowled me over. I listened to it solely because it was so highly rated on your list, and I wanted to experience it. And it instantly became one of my favorite albums of the year as well. I'm not going to spend, we've spent enough time in this segment, so I'm not going to rehash things that have already been better expressed by Jake. But I'll just say that this is certainly the best Black Gaze album in several years that I've heard. Anyway, not only does it make a subgenre that feels so historically tied to the mid 2010s feel urgent and new, and like something has been contributed to it that feels different and affecting in a new way, but it is also, for all the reasons you said, Jake, a deeply moving record. I think the lyric that stands out to me the most is, "I am too depressed to show you how depressed I really am." That's real.
Yep.
It's real as fuck. So
Mhm.
yeah, shout out to this album's incredible. Go and listen to it.
Caught him lacking on 9/11. I locked down like V.I. Leonard. People don't want the truth, they want me to tell them grandma went to heaven.
I remember back when we were first reviewing our number 5 pick, Maps by Billy Woods and Kenny Siegel, having the idea that it was going to take some time to fully unpack, and then also coming to the sort of realization that this was probably Billy Woods' most accessible album on that front, which makes it really interesting to talk about now, because I don't feel all that much closer to really understanding the enormity of what's being written about by Woods here, other than the emotional urgency that a lot of it has. I think the track that I think about most often on this album is probably NYC Tap Water. This is the year that I graduated college, moving back home about 2.5 hours across the state from where I was living to go to college when I was done. And a thought that I had all the time while I was away is that the tap water at home is not even like, it's not even like better. It's just different in a way that I can't describe. And even though it wasn't really different, I preferred it here And it's just that idea of this weird like city government controlled thing ending up being so specific and particular to region,
Mm.
separated by fairly arbitrary county lines, even it can be different.
It's that experience of like, you don't appreciate that until you've been deprived of it. And then you
Yeah.
return to it. And it's like you're suddenly waking up and realizing that, the world exists outside of me. The world isn't going to bend its whim to follow me. That tap water I like isn't always going to be there. The world is going to live and I'm going to live in it. And I'm going to be lucky when I get to overlap with those things about it that I enjoy, that I can rely on. But I know that I can never really rely on them. And that's the feeling of this whole album, I think, is like being grateful for the things in the world that you have that you enjoy, but also having those moments where you realize that shit, all of this could go away in a second, man. And I would have no way of changing that.
The value of distance, whether that good value is positive or negative to you, but just this sheer difference that it makes, and the various places that you will be in your life, and especially when you're away from what's home to you, and how that works and how that manifests in your life and how it can make every minute detail of your life different. But ultimately, sort of, I had this thought when we were talking about Cast Iron Skillet of like, despite you growing up on the polar opposite side of the world, it's much of the same experience because, ultimately people are kind of the same everywhere. And I think that's a lot of what the album is about, is that a lot of these anxieties are universally felt. But, so are so many of the good things. It's like, somebody else's New York City tap water is their tap water, and they probably find New York City tap water revolting. I probably wouldn't drink it myself. But it's integral to the pizza there. I know that much.
And again, that's like a neat little emblem for I think what a lot of the album is talking about is how easily we take for granted the things in our life that they'll always be there, that there's any kind of real stability. When in reality we live in a vortex of entropy. That's what the universe is. And yeah, sure, on a cosmic scale, where most of that entropy is stuff we won't be able to see or understand in our lifetime, but it all boils down into the micro level as well, where it's little things in our lives that are moving on without us. The album's about being in transit. The album's about specifically Woods being on tour, traveling across the country, and the weird feeling of going from place to place to place and losing your sense of identity and missing the people and things you had back home, missing your cat as well. Is a great line in New York City Tap Water where he talks about just how much his cat missed him. Um, and I love that song too because it's like that's the point of the album where he's arrived back home after being on tour across the album, and all these things have changed. There's a great line that I love. It's a great little bit that I love where he talks about, just this. I'm not sure whether it's a homeless guy or a drug dealer or whoever it is, someone that he typically sees on the streets, and who just doesn't recognize him anymore because he's been away for so long and that person's been so absorbed in their own world that, they've moved on without him. The way the whole album works you through the process of being on tour and being a performer where your whole thing is stability, right? You're performing the same songs that exist in this form all the time. Your performance identity is stability, but you're also, you know, living a very unstable life where all these things are changing around you and the people you love are becoming strangers and you're, only seeing them through screens and then you're feeling weird when you see them in person. It's in a lot of ways it's a record that's very timely and captures a lot of what it is like to live post COVID without ever mentioning COVID or being about it. It just embodies that weird space we all live in now. So yeah, one of my top 5 albums of the year for sure.
Blossom, the second album from Pupil Slicer, is my favorite mathcore album, period. This thing is completely singular. Yes, it's a mathcore album, but it's got elements of prog metal, of post-hardcore, of black gaze, of I mean, like there's even inspiration from metal bands like Liturgy on here with some of the breakbeat drums that you can find on some of the songs like midway through the track list. And its constant inventiveness is at every single turn is just so impressive that it was another album where, I liked it at first, of course, but like I had to keep listening to it because I had to understand it more. And that's one of the appeals of mathcore as a genre for me, is it's so unfriendly. It's such an ugly genre. Like from the ground up, it is so impossibly stupidly difficult to construct a solid mathcore song. But even then, there's no like telling as to whether or not people will actually like it, just because again, it is such an unfriendly genre. But like once everything clicks about a mathcore record in your head, once you start listening to this music and it makes more sense to you and you're able to isolate different components, then you get to a point with albums like this or the Dylan Driscoll Gateplan's Dissociation, where every single detail, it feels revelatory. Every single part of listening to this is so satisfying to me, uncovering all of this album's little secrets, and also discovering that it's a science fiction concept album about, the internal search for identity and reconciliation and mortality, and lots of these really fragmented and interesting existential concepts that the more I've explored this album, the more deeply resonant I felt it. This is an album that is very very gender, if you know what I'm saying. Parts of it I feel like will like really emotionally affect you if you actually let it, but that's beyond the fact that like the music itself here is so diverse and rawly impressive. But there's also an adoption of an atmospheric production style courtesy of the guy who's worked with bands like Loathe and Rollo Tomasi, where everything is so ubiquitous feeling, everything is so big, everything is so expansive and atmospheric that it never feels like the impact comes at the cost of anything else. It's such a well realized, balanced aesthetic vision for music, and nothing really sounds like it, to the point where, I'll get to the final leg of this album where, you have like a more electronically driven sort of interstitial track like Language of the Stars that leads into my favorite song of the year, which is Dim Morning Light, a song where I remember exactly where I was, what I was doing while I was doing it when I first heard it. And I just stopped moving, because as soon as this song breaks into its insane waterfall of sound, it stopped me dead in my tracks from the sheer beauty. The second chorus refrain on this with the key change is my favorite moment in music all year. It reaches into me and wrenches something primal out of me that I didn't even know existed. And it's, the way it discusses its themes of identity and self are things that I deeply, deeply feel. Sometimes you need something violent like this music to sort of shake you out of complacency and let you do your own probing when it comes to your own identity, a thing that I know that lots of members of this podcast are very preoccupied with when it comes to their music. But this is something that just broke the limitations of what I thought possible for heavy music this decade so far. Everything about this album fits together in a unified vision that I can only completely be marveled at. It's one of the musical experiences I've had this decade so far where it just, everything about it feels like it should be disparate and shouldn't work, but it slots together in a way that just feels right. It's cathartic, it's brutal, it's heavy, it's atmospheric, it's everything I look for when it comes to modern metal. The fact that Pupil Slicer are successful and still making music is a sign that music is alive and well. God bless Pupil Slicer, man.
All right, top three time. Moving in with number 3, we have one of the defining experiences of this year for me, easily, was when you and I sat down and listened to this for the first time, as we often do, and we put on Polaris, and we're like, oh yeah, okay, this is interesting. It's got like a bit of a really clean dream pop sound. This is very different from the last album, but it suits him, and he's like, it's fits very, very well. And boy, oh boy, were we in for a shock when 2 minutes into the song, the whole thing just blows up. And that to me, it was then and it remains the best moment in music this year. Not just because it sounds amazing and it's like, oh my God, this surprise of the song blows up and explodes and it starts to sound more like Paranormal, but like suddenly Paranormal through a kaleidoscope with all these different colors you didn't realize they could they could have, but just also the best moment of music because I got to share it with you, Jake, and because it was this thing where we were both simultaneously, like with the Smile song as well, we were both just simultaneously wrenched out of our like humdrum, depressing little lives and reminded of how much color there can be. And the great triumph of After the Magic is that it succeeds at delivering those moments to you again and again and again. Singling out songs on this record is pointless. I mean, I think that it is a masterclass in what modern shoegaze can sound like. I mean, this is the thing, like modern shoegaze is such a weird thing to say because you get a modern shoegaze that sounds like this, or modern shoegaze that sounds like Hotline TNT, or a modern shoegaze that sounds like, People Slicer, for instance. You could have modern shoegaze as such a meaningless descriptor because shoegaze can go in so many different directions now. It's opened up in so many different ways. But still nothing sounds like Paranormal. And yet at the same time, it's very tempting to draw very particular comparisons to very particular inspiration points, like My Bloody Valentine, early M83 as well, obvious reference points that the band pull from with this record. It's a glossy, high definition refinement of the more jagged, hard edged sound of 2021's phenomenal masterpiece, To See the Next Part of the Dream, still one of my absolute favorite albums of the decade. This album simultaneously softens Paranormal's approach so as to make the music more accessible to a wider audience, while also revealing all of these additional layers that you wouldn't have thought were possible just from that one album, or that would have seemed like a long shot for Paranormal to be able to successfully pull off so soon after that album. It's hard not to just gush with pure joy. And this is the thing, is I love so much that so many of the albums and things we've been celebrating this year are sources of great joy. The Young Fathers album, for instance, is a source of great joy to me. The Aesop Rock album is a source of great joy to me. The Rat Boys album is a source of great joy to me. There are many of the best albums of this year that make me feel happy to be alive. And none are more acute in that and more successful with that feeling than this particular album here, which is so limitless and so joyful and so utterly resplendent that it puts a smile on my face just to think about it. The time when this came out as well, it was winter for you guys, but it was summer here for me. We're heading back into that season now. I'm starting to feel all these kinds of emotions that I associate with that particular time earlier this year, which was easily the best time of the year for me. Just this blissful feeling of being able to drive around in the sun and listen to this album and share it with people and feel like good about the future, even if the rest of this year was a bit of a shithole. I still am able to put this album on and experience a wormhole into an alternate universe where the colors haven't drained out of the year for me and where everything still feels full of possibility and so, so exciting. I mean, nowhere is this more true than moments like the just ecstatic screams at the end of We Shine at Night, or my favorite section of the whole record, the final minute of Sound Inside Me, Waves Inside You, where it's just this booming piano chords and intense guitar and these gorgeous swirling vocals. It is indescribable and powerful and so fantastic. After the Magic by Paranormal has delivered in spades and all of the potential that Paranormal has always displayed. It's a joy to be able to follow this artist since we discovered them very shortly after the release of their breakthrough record, and to see them going from strength to strength and getting recognition from even as far as like mainstream music critics and music press, which is insane to me that they've had that level of crossover appeal. It's so deserved. One of the biggest success stories of the year, and so easy to forget because it was so early in the year. But we are blessed to have Paranormal. And a shout out as well to the live album they released After the Night, which showcased mostly material from To See the Next Part of the Dream, but also a 50-minute new song that proved to be their long season and lives up to all of the hype that such a proposition would suggest as well. There's nothing that Paranil can't do. They're at the cusp of fame, and the possibilities are endless, and they're soaking up and taking advantage of every moment of it. And I'm so, so sublimely thrilled that we get to experience it in real time.
Sufjan Stevens is one of the most important and interesting artists of our generation, to the point where his fan base is like spread across so many different years and generations that you're going to have people who are arguing that the first phase of his career is indisputably his best, or the 2010s are indisputably his best works, or this and this and that. He's just such a prolific but also monumental talent that anything he makes, even if it underwhelms, like something like The Ascension, it's going to be an event. It's going to be one of the biggest moments in whatever year it comes out in. And Javelin was certainly that. But I don't think anybody expected this to hit with the impact that it did, especially coming off the heels of the rather lukewarm reception that The Ascension got. But Javelin is a culmination of basically every sound that Sufjan has explored throughout his entire career, which is no small feat in and of itself, considering how divergent of an artist he's been. There are bits and pieces of every single stage all over this thing. But it's also, with the real life context of the record, it's sort of shed some new light onto how you can interpret the themes and the writing on here. But Javelin is an album that does not need its real world context to stand alone as the masterstroke that it is. It's a profoundly affecting examination of how moving on from loss is a continuous process that doesn't really ever end. Javelin's arc is not really an arc as much as it is a demonstration of something way more cyclical and universal. And Sufjan Stevens on the writing here stubbornly clings to the past and to his perception of love and personhood so tightly that he loses sight of the grand scope of things. And it's about becoming in touch with the spiritual nature of that aspect of life, which sounds kind of like high-minded and all, but with Sufjan's writing, it never feels like it's out of your reach. It always feels close to the chest. And I mean, like, everything that you could possibly want out of a Sufjan Stevens album can be found on here. Again, we've talked a lot about modern standards this year in terms of some of the best songs, and I feel like Goodbye Evergreen and Will Anybody Ever Love Me are songs that will be considered future standards of folk songwriting in the future. And So You Are Tired, of course, our song of the year, being a fantastic examination of the thorniness of this album. And Shit Talk is going to go down as one of the most monumental things that he's ever made. And again, no small feat from the guy who made The Age of Odds. But the fact that this is such a tight album, that it has such a defined narrative arc, that it combines so many different aspects of his sound, to me, it makes it an easy pick for my favorite Sufjan album, because it takes everything that I love about him and it engineers it in a specific way that I feel like it's him taking tighter control on his creative output, because he's a guy who's known for excess, for being extra, for making albums like The Age of Odds and The Ascension, which are, big and messy and long, whereas here there is a concerted effort to pare everything down to its bare essentials. And in doing so, I think he's made one of his sharpest statements as an artist, but also just the one that feels like it means the most. This is an album that, like all of the other great albums that I've fallen in love with this year, one that really had to grow on me, but also one that rewarded me like 10,000-fold the more I dived into it. With each listen of this album still, which this is still on my permanent rotation, I'm getting more out of the writing here, because he is just so dense and prosaic, and he's harnessing all of his classic strengths that you know someone like Sufjan to have, but combining it in a way that feels like this is one of the most definitive incarnations of his sound. It's a heartbreaking record, but like a lot of the other albums we're celebrating on here, it is ultimately a deeply affirming one. The note that this album ends on shows Sufjan moving on from what's happened to him, not in a definitive sense, not that it's all behind him. He's still dealing with things, but there is so much more to explore in the world than just what we see in front of us when we have the horse blinders of tragedy, of depression, of loss, of all of that shit. It's about moving forward and getting to see the world for all that it's worth. And I mean, it might sound glib or short-sighted or shallow when you put it in such fine terms like that, but when you have an artist as dedicated and as detailed as Sufjan, you can only feel the aching sincerity from that kind of sentiment, and it ends up being one of the albums that I've connected with the most this decade. In fact, I don't really feel like I felt this special of a connection with a record since Phoebe Bridgers came out with Punisher. This is a record that I just feel like is only going to get better with time, and has settled something that has been like something inside me this year has been so like utterly disquieted by the world around him, and this album feels like it's come and settled my soul in a way that I am just endlessly thankful for. It's again, when I capped off our Sufjan video, I said that Sufjan's the kind of artist that you're just grateful to be alive at the same time as during, and like I can't think of a more affirming musical statement than that, frankly. It's albums like Javelin are the reason that we have this podcast to begin with. And I'm just infinitely grateful that I got to experience it. And it makes me look forward to having other artistic experiences like it, because that's what's beautiful about the lives that we lead, as small and insignificant as they may be.
Our number one, the James and T Gold Medal album of the year, is none other than Jason Isbell and the 400 Units Weather Vanes, an album that we broke down to the atomic level on our video on it, to such a degree that me, the person who's rated this album the highest of us, was like, well, you all did all the work for me. And I don't really have heaps more to add to that particular discussion that we had, other than, it's just like, this is what it was like when, Bob Dylan was releasing just heater after heater in the late 60s and into the 70s. We're in that era for Jason right now, where it's just
Bro just dropped his blonde on blondes.
he wakes up and pisses excellence. Neil Young circa after the gold rush, maybe even a little after that, like Crazy Horse albums and whatnot. There's a specific flavor of Neil Young across most of this album that I really love. It's such an extraordinary snapshot of, at the very least, how I've felt for the past 12 months in a variety of ways. The joy and peace and the strife and fear and anxiety and looming feeling that things stop. And I think it's, his most musically accomplished album, probably his best sounding. The album in which he steps out as a producer by himself without the help of Dave Cobb for the first time. After all this time, can only just marvel at the immensity of what he's accomplished this year. Between this and having a really stellar, meaty role in a fucking Martin Scorsese movie, and a great documentary about the last album. And he got his teeth fixed and he can smile now. That dude's just always goofing now.
He looks, and I love he got his teeth fixed. Like, good for him, man. But he looks fucking ridiculous with those chompers.
It's weird.
He just, I remember the first time I saw a picture of him after he got his teeth fixed, I thought this is FaceApp. Like, this is not
Yeah.
a real photograph. It looks like he was FaceApp. I think there's a lot of ways in which you can describe Jason Isbell's songwriting, ways you could characterize him as a writer. One of the things I think he's greatest at is recognizing the inherent fragilities in all of us, like the ways in which we are delicately balanced and so at the mercy of things that are outside of our control. And of course, the biggest difference between us is largely, from Jason's perspective, how willing we are to accept and understand that fragility versus reject it and blame the world. The need to create some kind of meaning or some kind of scapegoat in the face of adversity versus the ability to understand our role in our lives and accept culpability where it exists and be able to move on and brush it off where there's nothing we can do. And so Jason, I think, understands that the weaknesses that we all have, the extent to which we all have to work for that strength, but we all have to work for that understanding. And that understanding other people is something you have to work for as well. It's something that takes work. It's not something that we're always necessarily universally taught to do. To some extent, we have some level of predisposition to take care of one another, but Jason's songwriting showcases how much work it can be to truly understand another person and to see things from their perspective and to be able to understand our role in their lives and also the limits of our influence in their lives as well. Sometimes we can't save someone else because we don't know how to or we don't have the capacity to, but sometimes we can't save someone else because it isn't our job to do that. Weather Raidens is just an album of songs that speak to the various experiences Jason's had over the last few years of his life, the place he's at in his life, the way he sees the world, the things that trouble him in terms of what seems to come up again and again in the world. There's songs on here like King of Oklahoma, which is about the opioid epidemic. There's songs on here like Save the World, which of course is about the epidemic of active shooters in America. There's songs in here like Cast Iron Skillet, which we talked about in our last video, which are about the toxicity of traditional truisms that are passed down through generations to essentially, hamper progress and to stop people from being able to fully express themselves. There's songs on here like Volunteer, which is about the alienation you feel and the coldness you can feel towards the place you grew up with, or the distance you can feel from it as you get older. Songs on here like Vestavia Hills, which is about a meta song about how unbearable artists can be, and about how when you set yourself this goal of being this, universal figure, this great man who understands people and is out there to convey understanding, you can create a savior complex or a god complex for yourself you need to be aware of. There's songs like Death Wish, which is about the pandemic of depression as well, and how poorly a lot of people understand it and are able to recognize it in the people that they love, and as a result of that, how poorly equipped a lot of people can be to deal with the pain of other people in their lives and how that can make the situation worse. I could go on. Jason is able to take things certainly that he experiences, but that we all experience to some degree or another, and render them through a lens that makes them easier to understand than almost any other songwriter that I've ever encountered. He is tender and he's careful, but he's assured. There's not a word that Jason Isbell writes that he doesn't mean. And all of that still comes with the understanding that he might feel differently, 3 or 4 years down the line, or that he's certainly fallible and certainly someone who is growing at every point in time. And that's ultimately the joy of the album, is it's a way to come to terms with your own vulnerability, your own permanence, your own fallibility, and become a stronger person, not by denying those things, but by embracing them. One of my absolute favorite songs of the year, one of my favorite songs Jason's ever written is If You Insist, which is a beautiful little song about recognizing that a total stranger, or maybe it's not a total stranger, but let's assume it is for the purposes of this point, recognizing that someone you've come across is in trouble, and recognizing within yourself the desire to help, the desire to make better, the desire to save, and stepping back from that and having the maturity and the grace to ask yourself whether you should be stepping into that world or not, whether you should be inserting yourself into that person's life or not. And it's not a song about self-reprimanding. It's not a song about scolding yourself. It's just a song that showcases an understanding for another person that is so deep and so true that it recognizes how little you matter in comparison to that person's world, and how if that person needs your help, you can make yourself available to them, and it is up to them to choose to let you in. The nuances in how Jason presents that situation and how he approaches it is something that's so seldom conveyed or communicated. Considering Jason as well in the context of the current resurgence of country music and pop culture as well, considering Jason's interesting sort of sideways place where he's not really someone who's very much in the limelight of pop culture country, but yet the genre and the conventions that he cut his teeth on and that he has a deep affinity and love for are now bigger in the pop culture mindset than they have been for a very long time. All of the things that Jason stands for and all the ways that he expresses himself are such a balm and such a beautiful breath of fresh air in comparison to that mass of pop culture country. And this is not me just saying it's all shit compared to Jason, even though compared to Jason, anything is bad. But it's just, I feel like the current moment we live in, where country is the biggest genre of music in the world right now, and so much of it is homogenized and so much of it is rooted in the kind of traditions and regressiveness that he's railing against in Cast Iron Skillet. It situates him to be one of the most important figures that we have in the artistic landscape, more than he ever has been before, because he is a response to it all. He is an antidote to it all. He is a clarification of it all, without ever setting that goal for himself, because I don't think he views himself in that way. But whether or not he does, that's what he is. He is what we need right now in the cultural landscape, because he's a reality check. And that's why this is my album of the year. A lot of reasons, but primarily because I think when I think about the most important album of this year to me, and when I think about the most important, music of this year musically, I think Jason Isbell's Weather Vanes is so important because it is a clarification and an antidote and a response and a cure for so much of the pre-packaged and cynical and lifeless content that is thrust down our throats, basically. Jason reminds us of the beauty in it all, of the possibility of craft, of the power of craft. And he is one of our greatest living artists in any medium for that and for so many other reasons.
You told me at the beginning of this year that by the end of the year, Southeastern would only be my third favorite Jason Isbell album. I'd have been like, that's highly fucking unlikely, but like, I guess anything's possible. And yet, here I sit. And even still, Something More Than Free being one of my favorite albums I listened to for the first time this year, even when listening to that, there's a little part of me where that album, 10 out of 10, where I'm just like, God, I wish this was produced like Weather Vanes. Because, like, listening to this album is delectable. It's a fucking treat. Every guitar tone is so crisp, so warm that just it feels luxurious almost. Listening to this is like you feel comfortable in the hands of an artist taking you wherever they want to go. And that's just a phenomenal fucking feeling, is when you know that you're in the hands of somebody who's confident in their vision for their artistry. And there's few people who I think who are more confident in their vision when it comes to country music than Jason Isbell.
Sometimes I think it's ridiculous that this is my third favorite Jason Isbell album. Like, what? What?
At a
It's
certain
so good
point,
though.
Feels
at a
wrong.
certain point, I feel like I was saying this to Jake with Animal Cave last night. At a certain point, it just doesn't fucking matter. We're
Yeah.
ranks. It's like just what ranking is the privilege of getting to be surrounded by a glut of greatness that we can even dare to do that. How dare we?
Goddamn right.
But no, it's fun too. I love this. This man and his music makes me so happy. All right, that brings us to the end of our 20 favorite albums of 2023. Let us know what you thought of any of these albums, and of course, let us know what your favorite albums of the year are. Drop that list in the comments below and let us know what we should be hearing. Let us know if we've missed anything important throughout the year. If you've been following us, thank you. If you're new to the channel, thanks for being here all the same. We can't wait to share more videos with you in 2024 and hope for another banner year for music, art, culture, and everything in between. We're gonna probably expand the channel a little bit more next year and start talking a little bit more about things that are beyond music. I mean, we already do, but we might keep continuing down that line as well. So we hope that you'll follow us. We hope that you'll stay tuned. It just occurred to me as I'm saying this that this video probably won't come out until very early 2024. So stay with us for the rest of this year. And let us know what you'd like to see on the
Stay
channel.
with us for all the years. Just stay with us.
As long as we're here, you stay.
Until next time, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, IKEA, the wonderful every day.